guys, this is Miss Brass, and now we are talking about Unit 3, Populations, topic 3.2, K-selected and R-selected species. So our learning objective for class today is to identify differences between K and R-selected species. We want to understand that populations change over time in a reaction to a variety of different factors. Both K and R-selected species can respond to changes in some different ways. And so we're going to be looking at some of the major characteristics of these two different types of species. The skill we'll be working with today is 5A. We'll practice describing patterns or trends in data and looking at how to make graphs and representations of our data. Okay, so K-selected species. Some of the major characteristics of K-selected species. They're often large, often have few offspring, but may reproduce multiple times during their lifetime, each time only having a few offspring at a time. They do provide parental care for their offspring. So K-selected species are those that spend quite a bit of energy raising their young. So they're not species that lay a bunch of eggs and then leave their babies to kind of fend for themselves. K-selected species provide quite a bit of parental care for their offspring. They also tend to live in a relatively stable environment, and they often experience relatively high competition. So an elephant would be an example of a K-selected species. Elephants do have few offspring. They might reproduce more than once in their lifetime, but they provide care for their offspring, and so they are considered a K-selected species. R-selected species, on the other hand, are often small. They are often species that have many offspring at a time. They provide little parental care to those offspring. Often they have a relatively short lifespan, and they might experience relatively low competition. Rabbits, for example, can reproduce quite a bit during their lifetime. They're small, short lifespan. They don't particularly provide a whole lot of parental care to that offspring either. Some other examples of R-selected species would be lots of varieties of fish where they're laying many eggs at a time. They're not caring for their young necessarily, but it's kind of like those that hatch and live, and those that don't. So they're not providing a whole lot of care to ensure that those offspring are successful. So looking at the image here, we want to identify which three of these would be considered a K-selected species. Take a moment, try to respond to the question. Okay, so moving forward here, another thing you need to be aware of would be invasive species. Invasive species are those that are not native to a particular region. So in some way, they are brought into that region, and in that region, their population spreads in a way that alters the ecosystem. So kind of a notorious example of this would be the lionfish in the Gulf of Florida. So the lionfish is an invasive species, not native to the region, and the lionfish is kind of a major issue in lots of different parts of the world because it doesn't really have many natural predators. And so as a result of that, its population is kind of able to grow out of control, and it can really wreak havoc on the rest of that ecosystem. One thing to keep in mind is that invasive species are typically R-selected species. So they're species that reproduce a lot of offspring at one time. They're not providing a whole lot of parental care. They're often small species, but they are small but mighty. So they can still have a huge impact on that ecosystem, even if the individual organisms themselves are small. The term biotic potential is something that you should be familiar with. So the biotic potential is the maximum reproductive rate of a population in ideal environmental conditions. And so when we say ideal environmental conditions, we mean there's plenty of food, no predators, no disease, kind of the best possible case scenario within the ecosystem. So the biotic potential we can see on the graph here is this period of exponential growth. We have a lot of growth happening in the population because there's plenty of food available. There's no predators that are controlling that population. There's no disease present within that population. And so we have this exponential growth curve where that population is able to increase dramatically. And we know that in real life, in the wild, populations cannot just grow continuously without ever stopping. So eventually, the population will stabilize at the carrying capacity when there when there is no longer an unlimited supply of that food. When resources begin to become scarce, or when the population becomes affected by disease or predators or other factors, that population does typically stabilize around the carrying capacity. But the term biotic potential just refers to the maximum reproductive rate within a population in those ideal conditions. One important thing to keep in mind is, although we talk about both K-selected and R-selected species, not all species are considered strictly K-selected or R-selected. So many species instead fall somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, where they might have some characteristics of K-selected species, but they might also possess some characteristics of those R-selected species. So it's important to understand those main characteristics, those main differences between both K and R selected species, because those species can have their own unique impacts on an ecosystem. So for your practice question, we'd like to practice looking at data and thinking about data and graphical representations of data. So for your practice for today, I'd like you to draw a graph that would represent the population size over time of an R-selected species that has just colonized a new habitat with abundant resources. Give that question a try and make sure to review your notes if you need some extra help.